So we're on to part 2. Oh yeah, we go. I've somehow jumped forward already, isn't it? So yeah, here we go. So Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. So they get back. If you remember, I don't think I've got a map of it this week, but the Israelites have predominantly focused around the Nile Delta, which the Bible calls the land of Goshen. We think of as the Nile Delta. There are a number of towns that get built there. Eventually, Pyrameses, which is the right next door to the town of Avaris, which was full of Semitics. We saw archaeologically. So the children of Israel are all focused up there. So so Aaron takes him back. And I think, again, we're speculating a little bit. If you remember a couple of weeks ago when we saw the development of the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet that was happening, remember we found that one of the first references actually refers to an Egyptian kind of overseer for the work in the mine whose name is Levi. So written in Semitic, in using images from Egyptian hieroglyphs, which becomes the world's oldest alphabetized language, Proto-Sinaitic, which you will regularly, if you go and look on academic articles, they'll tell you it's Proto-Phoenician or whatever, coming from Canaan. The only reason they say that is because they don't believe that Israel exists at this point. But actually, it's written in Semitic language, of which the Hebrews are the people who speak it. But at the time, before, some historians believe that there is an Israel, so it can't be them. It must have been Canaanite miners or whatever. But it isn't. It is Hebrew. And as I say, here is a guy who is acting for the Egyptians, which of course for the generations directly after Joseph is the case, from the tribe of Levi, acting in an overseeing type way, which I like to kind of capture that, because it seems. You wouldn't want to make a strong point of it, but as you run through, Levi seems to have emerged in a kind of an educated role, if I can put it that way, as a tribe. That God says to them, "You're going to teach all the people," and they seem to know how to read and write and so on. And so you just kind of wonder if somehow or other in the mix with Joseph, if there's and it's only in the tribe of Levi that we find Israelites with Egyptian names. So they seem to be the ones that got most integrated perhaps into the echelons of Egyptian society. Now I am speculating, I'm just kind of doing it for the colour and the feel. But so here comes Moses is from the tribe of Levi, Aaron is from the tribe of Levi. They come back. It may be that there is a kind of a semi unofficial kind of place of authority already in the Levitical clan within the people. Probably true also of Joseph and his family, but we just kind of get that little bit of a hint, I suppose. So anyway, they spoke all the words that Yahweh had spoken to Moses, and they did the signs, because obviously remember God's given him signs to do. So the people believed, and when they heard that Yahweh had visited the children of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. It's just interesting to notice that, isn't it? The people and the children of Israel are slightly different, if you notice. And I do have again, some people may not like it, it's my personal preference. I like to see, that Abraham is the Hebrew, he's of Eber, and God is the God of the Hebrews, and most ancient historians, archaeologists, etymologists, whatever, will tell you that the name Hebrew actually sort of means a stateless person. So it wouldn't be at all surprising for God to have drawn in other stateless people in this slave environment. So all of those people who are all there in this mixed up way, they may not be all part of the children of Israel, but they can all be happy. And probably a good number of them disappear out with them. They probably kind of join themselves too.
Say so, that a number of Egyptians left with them.
I think they're right. I'm sure you're right.
Yeah.
You could.
The Hebrews, was it something about crossing the river?
I don't know.
Origins of it.
Eber means from the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
presumably Abraham crossed over.
Or Eber, his grandfather Eber, isn't it? Perhaps because he crossed over from the other side. So anyway, they're all very happy. And then we have this kind of run, and as I say, because of the focus of what we're doing, where are we? Oh, okay. Oh, that was the final slide. Yeah, okay. So the final slide of the last time. This is the section that we're supposed to be starting on, plagues to pass over. There we go. So Moses returns roughly 40 years after he's fled Egypt. So he's come together. He's pulled the tribes together, but we know it refers to 40 years, but 40 years is what often that kind of, it's a big chunk of time. The reason I put perhaps roughly 40 years is because just fitting the timings together, there's a pharaoh whose name is Dutymos, sometimes referred to as Tutimoeus, who reigns 44 years after Sobek-Hotep IV. And really he does look like a prime suspect for the pharaoh of the Exodus. So obviously if we're being really strict and saying 40 years is exact, it doesn't quite work. But actually what we find is 44 years after Moses has effectively left under the reign of Sobek-Hotep, the king who's in place actually is a king who oversights a number of disasters, which don't half incredibly look like the Exodus. and actually if you add up and we're taking it from a papyrus where the pharaohs are all listed, and you can add up them, so you can get a solid number. That's where you get the number from. It could be as low as 42, it might be 46, but it's somewhere in that region. We know 42 to 46 years after Sobek-Hotep IV comes a pharaoh called, technically I think we refer to him now as Dutymos. In some ancient texts he's referred to as Tutimoeus. And actually he oversights a period where we have all sorts of things happen which have an incredible kind of resonance with the story of the Exodus.
Question. I read, I don't know, it just rings a bell. I read recently that some papyri or something have been found listing a lot of calamities.
Yeah, well,
are we talking? Is that what you're referring to?
I'm not referring to that yet. We're coming to that. the Ipuwer, or it's sometimes referred to Ipuwer, or it's called the Admonitions of the Sage, is the reference where it comes in his reign. It is in his reign, but actually sorry, what I was referring to here was the papyrus where you can see between Sobek-Hotep and Dutymos is 44 years. And Dutymos, there's a number of things, not just this one, a number of things that actually do look like they can relate to the Exodus. One of which, although we can't say it's specifically in his reign because it comes after and it's referring back to events, so it's something that comes.
It's a history of.
So it's a kind of a history, supposedly by an eyewitness who's telling a future generation what he saw. Is the reference that Howard is talking about. So there's a papyrus from that period immediately after the 13th dynasty. Here we go. So this is a different papyrus now. There's one that comes immediately after this, after the 13th dynasty. Dutymos is the last pharaoh of the 13th dynasty. It all collapses under him. So just after that, they refer back and they refer to something called the Asiatic disease, refer to a plague that's hit them. And remember, an awful lot of Egyptians are going to die. And actually, this is often seen as an explanation, regardless of whether you see the Exodus or not, but among archaeologists, that explains to them why they discovered at Tel Adaba, which is the city now in the city of Avaris, i.e. Goshen, which is where we know that the Israelites were living, and there are lots of shallow burial pits in which bodies have been thrown without due funeral rites. They have all therefore the markers of it being something that is a disaster, and you just have to get rid of the bodies quickly. You can't go through all of the process. We don't have the energy to. And immediately after that disaster, what we discover is that the Semitic population leaves Avaris. It just disappears. So there is a disaster that requires people to be buried in shallow graves without due care and process. Well, of course, the death of the firstborn isn't all about children. It's the firstborn. Sorry, I'm not laughing. It's something that's quite tragic, in its way. But there's a huge loss of life across Egypt, and so you've got this. Here's a proper piece of archaeological evidence. We have reference to it in a papyrus, and they refer to it as being the Asiatic disease. And the Asiatics is the name for peoples that come, including the children of Israel. It includes others as well, but they come from Asia rather than from Africa. So it's they saw it as something that's related, a disease that was related to those people. And there's also an ancient Egyptian document which is now being dated to the end of the 13th century, or the 13th dynasty, not 13th. It was originally, when it was originally found, it was dated much earlier, but work was done back, I think, in the 80s, and it's now kind of reasonably universally accepted as belonging to the second intermediate period, of which the end of the 13th dynasty belongs to that. If you remember, the intermediate period is where things start to break up, and Egypt is in various regions at this point, and we saw that was beginning to happen in Moses' day. Moses is the daughter of he's not the daughter. He is the adopted son of the daughter of one pharaoh, and that daughter marries the pharaoh next door, and they consolidate those areas. So it's the intermediate period that he's come into. It's now been dated towards the end of that. In it, there's this sage Ipuwer who admonishes the reigning pharaoh by telling him stories of disasters that he's witnessed as a result of not having dealt properly with foreigners. Now, it parallels the biblical plagues, but it's often rejected as testimony for two reasons. I say it's often, it almost always was, because the events are seen as too fantastic. There are things like the slaves all leave with lots of money. Okay, that's one of the things that happens. We won't cover that tonight because we're not getting that far. We'll keep kind of referring back to it as we go through the. And apparently it was too early for the Exodus, but that's been based on days when we thought that Ramesses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. You see, now it's been dated to exactly the period that we believe the Exodus is happening in. See, well, when I say it's exactly the period, there are two reasons why some would say it wasn't. From the biblical point of view, it's right there, 1450 BC. And with the reworking of the chronology that was done of Egypt, which was not to make it fit with the Bible for totally other reasons, it brings Dudimos up to the same period. So it's in exactly the same period. The two coincide. So now, if you take that view, the two have now come together. So the testimony of Ipuwer. As we go through, we'll see it's not every plague, but we'll see there are references to things in Ipuwer that relate to the plagues of Egypt as they hit. So the date for Ipuwer's testimony fits perfectly with the dates of the Exodus in the Bible and the new chronology for Egypt. So therefore the plagues are historic in that sense. They are testified to by another document. If I explain a little bit, because I haven't put everything on the slides, because in fact I was running out of time. Anne very kindly prints these out, and I sent them to her at 6. And I kind of had to rush the slides because I was running out of time. So there's more that we could have put in. But one of the things that is often said about the testimony, I'm determined to get a copy of it now. I've read snippets of it, but I want to read the whole thing now. Is that it kind of doesn't describe itself in sensationalistic ways. It describes itself as a warning being given seriously, referring to events which are only called fantastic because people don't believe they really ever happened in Egypt. They're not fantastic from a biblical point of view. They're just fantastic from people's perspective. And they're saying, well, despite the fact it looks like he's giving an eyewitness testimony, it's clearly made up because therefore there isn't anything like this in Egypt's history. But as I would say, it's kind of a testimony to the fact that the plagues of Egypt are proper history. They are historic events because they've got a separate testimony written by an Egyptian in Egyptian, not just a biblical account. They're also understood as natural consequences of just a couple of unusual events, as we're going to see. We've seen this kind of run of things has now happened a few times, not the whole 10. I remember back in the 80s, I remember watching a Channel 4 documentary, which was really interesting because it was triggered by the fact that about 4 years before they made the documentary, about 6 of the plagues of Egypt happened in America, one after the other in a single town. And what they noticed was that they were all connected. They were all the natural flow of an unusual first event. And so, as it's been studied, we actually discover that most of the 10 plagues, certainly 9 of them, all really relate to just 2 unusual incidents. One is a weather instance, and the other is an algae bloom, and everything else flows out of those 2 things. But what's interesting here is sadly, if I put it this way, the word commentary, because the word is the kind of the gold standard for evangelical Bible study. Sadly, and I don't want to be dissing it too much because it is just one of the worst of their. Sorry, it's one of the worst of their commentaries that I've read, the guy who wrote it, kind of, I think his whole approach is, well, I know that people have done this, but we're not going to look at it because it's irrelevant, because really Exodus is just a story that's been constructed to show theology. You see, the evangelical is kind of like not treating this as serious history, but kind of just ignoring the fact that if it was just a made-up story, how come all these events fit with our modern understanding? How did they get that right? They got darn lucky, is one way of putting it. The only logical explanation, which is easier as a non-Christian historian to believe, is that someone actually experienced them. They actually saw one after the other. That makes sense. So in that sense, the plagues are scientific. So they're historic, they're scientific, but each of them, and this is why he writes this, actually does have a theological reason to it. And we haven't got time to really unpack all three dimensions in all three of them, so we're kind of doing a summary view at speed over the top. I've put that little phrase from Exodus 12, I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. There is actually a very theological dimension to each of the plagues. And so that's why someone could say, well, if someone was inventing a story, they might take each of the Egyptian myths and produce a miracle to show that God's more powerful than that. Does that make sense? And that's the logic. And the truth is, it does do that. You know, those things are there as well. So let's just kind of. So here we go. Plague number 1: the Nile turns to blood. So Moses and Aaron did so, doing what God's told them to do. In the sight of the Pharaoh, in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that were in the river died. Oh, they did so, sorry, that's not very helpful. What they did was poured out. Remember, they pour out the water onto the ground. Just the reference there. Were turned to blood, and the fish that were in the river died, and the river became foul, and the Egyptians couldn't drink water from the river, and blood was throughout all the land of Egypt. So Ipuwer tells us in the admonitions of the sage, the river is blood, and as you drink of it, you lose your humanity and you thirst for water. So he talks about a time when the river has turned to blood and people couldn't drink it, and so they were going thirsty. He goes on, sorry, so did I skip a slide? Did I skip one? Yeah, I knew that I'd got some reference. You shall take that, there we go, I knew that they did so, referred to something that I'd missed. You shall take of the water of the river and you pour it on the dry land, and the water which you take out of the river will become blood on the dry land. Ipuwer says, see, Egypt has fallen to the pouring of water. So what triggers the falling of Egypt in Ipuwer's story, in his admonition, his warning that you need to deal with foreigners quickly, is why? Because when it fell to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery. And this is how Moses starts the whole thing. So you've got a kind of a totally independent, if you like, eyewitness reference from an Egyptian point of view of how Moses starts the whole thing by taking water and pouring it out. And as we see in the result of that, as we read about it in the Bible, and so they did that, they poured it out on the side of Pharaoh and the side of everyone, the fish die, the river becomes foul, the Egyptians can't drink it, and Ipuwer says, and the river is blood, and as you drink of it, you lose your humanity and thirst for water. Losing your humanity probably means you go mad with thirst. You know, it's that you get dehydrated. And you're like yeah. Okay, so the plague 1 and the Nile turning blood. The Nile was the life of Egypt, and his life was actually connected to their god Happy. I don't know, it's not a great name, is it? Who is seen, the word letter N there is disappearing under that graphic, I can see. He was seen as the father of Egypt. So it's kind of interesting, he's right at the beginning. The Nile is the father of Egypt. Well, it's not the Nile, and technically Happy is not the Nile, but Happy is the god of inundation who comes with the inundation of the Nile, and who's seen as the father of Egypt. He's actually presented as having both breasts and a swollen belly, so he's kind of both male and female. He's kind of this parental role, which is interesting that it's therefore the first one that really gets hit in this mix. I kind of put in the little reference that Jesus actually is the water of life. He promises to bring the springs of living water. There's something actually we should see ultimately in Jesus. What I wanted to do was have the time to put something of that on each of these, but I ran out of time. So the first few, I've got those kind of little kind of summary references to Jesus. And from that scientific point of view, I think I've got I've chosen, this is 1990s, which is after the one I've referred to, which happened in the 80s. But it's quite a big one. That millions of fish died in the place where the York River runs into Chesapeake Bay. Is that the right way to say it, Sharon? I never know with these American names.
Chesapeake.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, Chesapeake. And the cause was a massive algae bloom of something called Gymnodium brave. There's a number of algae though that can bloom, and they tend to make the water red because they tend to be red. But they don't happen upstream in the freshwater. They come at the joining of the two, because the freshwater is often bringing nutrient-rich water down into the estuaries, and it's the nutrients that cause the blooming of the algae. Now remember that where the children of Israel are, and the territory of Egypt that they're in, is in what is referred to as Lower Egypt, which is the Nile Delta as it runs into the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the second intermediate period, and so although we've seen that there are Israelites all the way down in places like Thebes, if we're talking about a pharaoh, we're talking about different pharaohs in those two places, even though there are people spread around the whole place. Some of them may have kind of been drawn out with them. But these incidents are happening up in the Nile Delta, which the Nile Delta, particularly at the time, is running into saltwater marshes. So the water is brackish, which means algae can thrive in it. It comes down after the inundation. It's got a huge amount of nutrients because they fertilize Egypt. They overfly the River Nile. The waters recede and leave nutrients all over the soil. So those nutrients that the algae can feed on. So these things happen. They tend to bloom where freshwater rivers, which are rich with nutrients, mix with salt water, because that's where the algae come from, and it needs to also be very hot. In the Nile Delta, the freshwater Nile flows into the saltwater marshes, therefore the first plague most likely happens in September when the weather is the hottest, just because these are the conditions that produce something like this. Now, the reason I flagged the dates is because what you actually find is the run of dates for the plagues all makes scientific sense as well, as we're going to see in terms of the seasons that are happening as we naturally run through. They don't all happen day after the other, but that's something that humans often do. We squeeze it all up as if it all happens in a week. But they do kind of flow. There's a process, and you can imagine the arguments going on and the negotiating, and then it moves on, and there's another. The next month comes, and the next thing is happening, and then the next month, and the next thing is happening. So, but it gives us a nice marker that if this is, which is likely, because what happens is the red algae kill the fish, and and the fish die, and they actually kind of quite acidic, I think, and they tend to bleed, so you get the blood of the fish in the water as well. Is it in this kind of acidic style of water, which of course means that the water is now undrinkable as well, and who knows how far the issue kind of goes back up the river. And so that seems to happen around December, and of course then, here we go. Sorry, yes, I got the. We come on to the plague of frogs. So there's a book I haven't got, which now I keep thinking I must get this one. Sorry, I'm laughing. I kind of the good thing is, because I'm writing the books I'm writing, I can put all these commentaries down as a business expense. So it makes me feel a little bit better every time you spend 20 quid on one book, you know. But because it's quite recent, the historical commentary on the book of Exodus, or the history of Exodus, this guy Hauptmann observes that the Nile actually teems with frogs from September to October. So the hottest point where the algae are likely to bloom happens in September, and September to October is the time all the frogs are turning up. Okay? So it's exactly the period that the water is polluted, it's killing the fish, and the frogs don't like it either, but they've got an option because they have little legs. So they can hop out of the water and go somewhere else. And where do they go? Well, they go for damp and shaded places. So they go into people's houses, because no one wants to sit out in the baking sun. If you're a little frog, you want to find a corner where there's maybe a little bit of damp and some water, and so go into Pharaoh and tell him, if you refuse to let them go, behold, I'm going to send a plague on all your borders with frogs, and the river will swarm with frogs. And they'll come up and go into your house, and into your bedrooms, and into your bed, and your ovens, and into your kneading troughs. The frogs shall come up both on you and on the people and all your servants. So millions and millions of frogs leave leave the Nile because it is acidic and it's poisonous for them. So the two are connected, and interestingly, one of the most enduring of Egypt's gods is Heket, who is the god of birth and renewal, who regularly has the head of a frog. Sometimes he even has the whole body of a frog. In the Osiris myth, the story of Osiris, who is the son of who's it the son of? It's one of the main gods. I can't remember which one now. In the Osiris myth, she actually is the one who breathes life into the new body of Horus. So Osiris is dying, and Horus is a kind of son, and she breathed life into him, and he's kind of seen as the resurrection of Osiris. So in Egyptian mythology, she actually becomes a kind of a symbol of resurrection. She actually is thought to have become the Greek goddess of witchcraft, whose name is Hecate, which is Heket becomes Hecate in Greek. And in medieval Egypt, because remember a lot of these gods kind of run right the way through into the early church period, you could still find her amulets because she was often carried by pregnant women. The amulets were carried because she was about birth. But the amulets are often now contain the words of Jesus, I am the resurrection. And the resurrection and the life even. So it's just kind of interesting because in the end Jesus becomes the real deal. He's the resurrection who breathes his spirit into his followers, you know, if you see it those ways. So you see this sort of theological thing dealing with the gods in the plagues as we go along. The next thing that happens is it's gnats from the dust. And we often think of it just as gnats. Or depending on your translation, it might say lice, it might say midges, something like that. Because the Hebrew word it covers a whole host of things. It's kind of small bitey things. They're small bitey things. But the issue with the dust is actually in Egyptian thinking, just so they are connected. Gnats were connected with the dust. So they kind of saw that coming out of little puddles or whatever, they'd kind of come up. They're almost like little bits of dust floating in the air. So stretch out your rod and strike the dust of the earth. So it's quite deliberate in that sense. Moses kind of, in their thinking, as he strikes it, up come the gnats. They go through all of the land of Egypt. They did so, and there were gnats on man and on animal, and all the dust of the earth became gnats all out the land of Egypt. And the way that it's described there, and therefore the way of the understanding, is it's dealing with this connection between the earth and the gnats, which therefore kind of gives it a connection. Oh no! Before I get to that, I've got actually the gnats from the dust. The gnats or the lice could be either midges or mosquitoes, but the fact that the livestock die, which isn't yet, it's plague 5, but it's coming, implies that they're probably the colicid midges. Coelicoid, I don't know how you say that, because the coelicoids transmit several diseases and parasites, which can kill livestock and cattle. So we have this kind of plague of gnats. Hauptmann's historical commentary tells us that the midges peak in October. So it's just October to November. So you can see how we've seen this run of events. Hottest weather's in September, that's when algae blooms. The frogs teem in October to November. And November to December is when the gnats turn up. The gnats kind of turn up because naturally the Nile is receding, leaving this kind of the damp puddles and ponds in the ground, which the larvae are kind of grow in before then they dry out and they fly away as gnats. You see, so as the Nile is receding, the gnats are appearing. And naturally frogs are their predators, but of course there aren't any frogs now because they've all died out and dried, and they've been piled up in heaps by the Egyptians. So with no natural predators, there are just loads more than normal. So there's always a lot of gnats, but this year it's really unbearable because millions of frogs that normally ate millions upon millions of gnats didn't eat millions upon millions. If they didn't get eaten, there are extra millions upon millions. So that Geb is the god of the dust of the earth, or the god of the earth. So he's that little image. He's sometimes also called the father of snakes. So he's sometimes depicted with a snake's head. That little image down the bottom. You see that rather weird looking kind of human body with a snake head. Leaning over the top of him is his wife. What's her name? She's the god of the sky. I can't remember gods, but I cut her out because she wasn't relevant. We'll come across her in a minute. I just put the kind of, I was running out of time here, so it's getting kind of rather brief. But obviously, there's a Jesus crushes the serpent's head. That's a prophecy from the earliest days before we ever got here. So you kind of have a kind of connection with Geb, who seems to be in view with the gnats coming out of the dust of the earth. Actually, at that point, it says the magicians tried with their enchantment to produce gnats, but they couldn't, and there were gnats on man and animal. So at this point, something seems to happen that goes past the power of the priests of Egypt to kind of. They've been trying to reproduce the miracles that Moses has done, not because it's particularly helpful, but to kind of. It's kind of like saying, well, yes, okay, he's doing this to us, but it's not that miraculous because we can do something similar. They've obviously come up with some sort of frog out of the bag trick, but somehow or other producing gnats out of the puddles is a natural process that God has kind of made extreme, and when they try it try and demonstrate it, they seem to fail. So there's a kind of a failing of the gods of magic, which Thoth is the god of magic. So I think the little reference to their failure kind of highlights in terms of where they're drawing their occult power from, being surpassed. Plague 4, we move on to flies. The Egyptians, of course, have piled up the dead frogs, as we read about that in Exodus, which means they're a fantastic breeding ground for flies. That's not rocket science. Anyone who's got a compost heap knows about that phenomena. So if you're not let my people go, behold, I'm going to send a swarm of flying things on you and on your servants and on your people. And into your houses and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, even the ground where they are. Now, the actual Hebrew word there for flies actually covers all kinds of flying insects. Because the ancient world doesn't have quite the same kind of taxonomy that we do. We kind of group things into all flying kind of buggy type things. So the difference is gnats are bitey things and the flies are flyy things. Is that making sense? The reason I'm saying that is I think it is flies. We think of flies because flies grow in, but in the Egyptian mindset, these things are very similar to Khepri, god of creation and rebirth, who we normally see with the beetle head. There is actually an image of him, but I couldn't find it quickly on the internet, which shows him with a fly's head, because they are kind of understood as the same sort of, they belong to the same class in Egyptian thinking. So almost certainly it seems to me that the issue of the flies is a kind of is addressed towards their fly-headed or the beetle-headed, the flying insecty. You can see a little bit on this little motif down here. Can you see one of them's clearly got a beetle and the others have just got antennae like other bugs? Can you see that in the dealing of the little kind of? So he's associated with all of those types of things. The god of creation and rebirth, the movement of the sun. So he's obviously at view here. And as I say, I've got nothing there in the middle. I was hoping to kind of put some bits down, but we're running out of time. And keeping an eye on the time, we're probably running out of time this evening. So we'll just skim through these, but you'll hopefully see enough of the connections as we go. Oh dear, I've misspelt Yahweh there. The hand of Yehweh. The hand of Yahweh is on your livestock, which are in the fields. This is the 5th plague, cattle get sick. On your horses, on donkeys, on camels, on the herds, and on the flocks, with a very grievous pestilence. And Yahweh did that thing on the next day, and all the livestock of Egypt died, but the livestock of the children of Israel, not one died. Just put there are 2 viruses that kill all of the livestock that's listed. A quick little comment, because sometimes you will see this, people say, oh well, camels weren't domesticated, so what are the camels doing in that list? Actually, you know how words change their meaning, and it happens in every language. And actually, in the earliest, you regularly it comes up. You see it sometimes every now and again. So on BBC News once, where they're talking about latest research shows that the Bible's wrong because of so-and-so went on a camel, and camels weren't domesticated at this point in Arabia. Well, first thing is, we're not actually totally 100% sure when camels were domesticated in Arabia, but the second thing is the etymological one, which is if you go back far enough, the word camel simply means an animal that carries something. It's livestock that carries stuff for you. Does that make sense? And of course it becomes in the end associated. So unlike, you think of an ox, very often ploughs your fields and provides meat and all of those sorts of things. So it's not always an animal that carries something for you. You see, so the word that becomes camel, if you go back far enough, is just simply a beast of burden. eventually, across the Middle East, everybody's using camels as we know them today. The Hebrew letter gimel is the word for camel as well. And interestingly, it actually shows a leg walking, because it's something that carries something for you. It's kind of a walker for you. It's kind of what the picture of it is. But there are two viruses that can kill all of those livestock, including camels, whether they were there or not, which is both African horse sickness or blue tongue, the two diseases or viruses as they're referred to, both of which are actually transmitted by the culicoids midge, which is kind of common in Egypt, and we've learnt that there were loads of them flying around, and the reason they were is because they didn't get eaten. So you can kind of see, again, you're seeing there's a kind of a natural flow and a progression. There is a sense, but it shouldn't be a huge shock to us, because Moses kind of says to Pharaoh, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. But you can say, well, actually, this is kind of looks like it's unraveling. But that is a kind of, there is a sense in which God is pretty kind of sure of what he knows is going to happen. He set the thing up, and actually it's going to hugely weaken the nation of Egypt, and it's going to allow his people to leave.
Is there any explanation as to why the Israelite stock wasn't affected?
The thought of some is that actually that their accommodation is further away from the river, so they are pastoralists, not they don't live on in the
riverbanks.
On the riverbanks. Now you can say, okay, but this is where we're talking about. There is a supernatural element too, but there's also a natural potential. Is if you tend to live further away from the water because you tend to want to be near the firmer ground, so that you can pasture your flocks and so on. You would be a little bit further away, but yeah, and there can be all sorts of things to do with, I guess, if the wind carries them somewhere. But all of these things, we have to see the Lord's in the midst of the natural process. Sorry, this is one of those funny little things. When I was 17, so I just I was really wanting to follow Jesus because I'd just been healed from cancer. Some of you know my story at 16. And I was at school, and I found it difficult telling all my friends where I'd become a Christian and so on. I was part of we had a CCF section, and I was in the RAF cadets. We went off for a weekend of gliding, which is one of the nice things you used to do. We're all kind of sitting there, and we're absolutely covered in midges. and I thought, and I kind of was, everyone was moaning about them, and I thought to myself, I wonder what I should do is I should tell them to go in the name of Jesus. Sorry, I'm laughing. But obviously that seemed a bit embarrassing in front of my friends. So I kind of moved off to the side a little bit. And when they weren't looking, I went, in the name of Jesus, I'm telling you to go. Go in the name of Jesus. So I did actually tell them out loud to go, all these midges to go in the name of Jesus. Sorry, this is just... And then I kind of went back to where they were all sitting. And I was looking down, I can see it. I still got midges on me. It didn't work, And then a guy called Peter, I remember exactly who it was, suddenly swore at me. He goes, how come you're the only person around here who's not absolutely covered in these things? And I thought, okay, there's a kind of an interesting thing. I've got a choice of perspective here. Actually, I've got a handful of things on me, and they're all covered. And I did tell them to go, and actually, it seems like most of them are gone. And I'm actually hearing this from someone who's not a believer and doesn't know what I've done. Now, if I'd been full of faith and evangelist, I would have said. I didn't. I just kind of went, oh, really? But so what I'm saying is, we're not kind of by explaining a natural process, we're not in any sense denying the place and the need and the requirement, if you like, for those things, and that's part of the kind of life we tend to lead, isn't it? We have those experiences, they may not be as often as we want or whatever, but we know for a fact we've had those kind of experiences. So, in Plague 5, of course, the cattle get sick, as we said. We're going on with the cattle. I was probably, bulls are big news. Cows and bulls are big news when it comes to worshipping gods. I've chosen Hathor, but there are a whole stack of minor deities that also kind of manifest and are associated with bulls. But Hathor is a goddess of love and protection, would often appear as a cow. So there's a lot of minor deities involved as well. So that's an image of her there as a kind of a cow with a human body. So we got the kind of the theological element being addressed. And they took the ashes of the furnace, they stood before Pharaoh, and they sprinkled it up towards the sky, and it became a boil breaking out, boils on man and on animal. And again, there are various illnesses that produce boils that are spread by flies. Perhaps these boils are there's a disease called glandor, which is caused by the Pseudomonas moli bacteria, which is carried by flies. There's an interesting little kind of a point which I haven't put on a slide. When they're in, I think it's in Deuteronomy, when they're in the wilderness, and God talks about putting the plagues of the Egyptians on them, and it talks about the boils, and it talks about them being around their knees and the lower legs. It's kind of interesting because there's a particular type of fly, I can't remember which one it is, which tends to bite around that area. So if that is the case, if actually the boils had a tendency to be in the lower leg, which is as it's described in Deuteronomy, then actually it would be kind of an inadvertent kind of confirmation of the idea that they're spread by the flies, because of where they tend to bite, where the location of the bites tend to happen. So the boils, in one sense, it hits at Isis, who's the goddess of medicine, and also Sekhmet, who controlled plagues. But interestingly, the boils make the priest ceremonially unclean. In the Egyptian priesthood, if you got boils, you weren't allowed to minister as a priest, which meant the whole of the Egyptian religious system collapses at this point. And interestingly, the priests disappear from the story. They stop trying to do things, presumably because they're now all off having to kind of cleanse themselves, because the whole religious system has failed. Which actually, if you stop and think of the psychological impact of that, is you're going through these tough times. What do? You go and see your pastor, you go and see your priest, and suddenly they're not there to minister because they can't, because they themselves are sick, every single darn one of them, and so the whole system has kind of collapsed, and Egyptians are left without, if you like, spiritual moral support in this process as to what to do, and it's getting quite drastic at this stage, and we're working our way towards the end now. And then the second thing happened, because in many ways everything we've seen so far really flows out of that first algae bloom. It's just pushed slightly to the extreme, but actually the flow of things is, and that is the thing that happened, as I said, when I saw the documentary on Channel 4. It just happened a few years before in some river in the US, which had an algae bloom that had killed the fish, that had pushed frogs out, that then meant there'd been loads more midges and flies. And I don't know whether meant the biting of it, but it made people go, oh, actually there's a run of things here that actually happens. But here, this is a totally different thing now. Suddenly there's something in the weather, and there's massive hail thunderstorm. There's lightning as well. The hail struck through all the land of Egypt and all that was in the field, both man and animals, and the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. The flax and the barley are ruined. The flax was in the ear, and the barley and the barley in bloom. And in Ipawa, we read, as he's describing this disaster, he says that gone is the grain of abundance. It's a simple little phrase, but actually he describes it's all disappeared, it's all gone. Here we have a wider description in Exodus as to how come it all disappeared. So this plague of hail from the sky is probably therefore related to Nut, who is the goddess of the sky. You can see I'm running out of time, so we're just kind of throwing things onto the slides here. So when I've got time to go back to this, I want to actually kind of put a New Testament reference. But as I'm sitting here now, as we're doing the run of it, I can't draw them out. I'm 100% sure they're all there, because over the years I kind of think, oh yeah, that relates to this verse and that to that, but didn't quite get there. We're nearly there though. Plague 8, the hail destroys the crops. Oh, hang on, what have I just done? Have I got my numbers mixed up? Okay.
I think that's basically must be a bit of a repeat of the previous one.
Let's repeat.
Oh, I've done it. Have I done it twice? So 6 is boils, 7 is hail. 8. Okay. Yeah.
You got the wrong number.
I got the wrong number. Yeah. Okay. It was. I was really rushing at the time because Yeah, and needed time to print them all out, which is very kind of you. Thank you, Anne. I actually know that I closed the file at 5:59, which meant that Anne couldn't have started printing it until after 6, and was down here at 7. So you see, we're running it rather tight.
It's the locust.
Oh yes, it should be the locust at 8, shouldn't it? Yeah. Rats. I missed out the locust. Yeah.
No, you're right.
Okay.
No, the verse
Oh,
is
yeah.
correct.
It's just the top line. It's just the top line. So it should say the locust. Yeah. Yahweh brought an east wind on the land all that day and all the night. When it was morning, the east wind brought the locust. There we go. Yeah. So it is the season for locusts. It's another weather phenomena. It's not necessarily related to the hail, but so it could be a separate thing. But yeah, it seems to bring them in. In Ippawa, he kind of tells us that the food supplies are running short, grain is lacking on every side, the storehouse is bare, the way he's describing it. So we've had this kind of combination of events. I've been splitting his words up against these things, but they've destroyed the crops, basically. And what do? How do you offer sacrifices? How do you placate the gods who seem to be failing you at this point when all your priesthood has disappeared? You can think what turmoil the Egyptian mindset is in at this point. Seth was the god of chaos and storms, because it's an east wind that brings the locust. Osiris is the god of the underworld and the vegetation. Strange that mix, because vegetation kind of grows up from the ground, and those things have both. There's been no control over the storm. Osiris has failed them. Sorry, Seth has failed them. Osiris, therefore, has now been all his vegetation eaten. And then finally, there's darkness. I said finally because we're going to do the Passover next week. So we're doing 9 of 10 plagues. So the Bible tells us Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and there was thick darkness in the land for 3 days. Ippawa tells us those who had shelter are now in the dark of the storm. The whole of the delta cannot see. So in his, as I say, in the future, referring back to the disasters of not dealing with a foreign people, he has covered, as we've gone through it, the Nile being blood, that the crops have been destroyed and they've all disappeared, and that now he's saying that people can't see it. In the Nile Delta, he's describing the same region that we're talking about. The Nile Delta, it's all gone dark, it's all gone black, and we can't see. And of course, if we'd had time to really tie in, of course, we know, in the crucifixion there is a period of darkness, just as this one is a period of darkness, which precedes, of course, the death of a firstborn, which is how it's going to finish, but in a different sort of way when we get to the New Testament. So Ra is the sun god. He's actually part of the creative kind of layer of the gods who are part of creation. And Ra is now failing. He's been blocked out by the darkness. So that's the end of where we got to. We'll leave number 10 for next time, when we'll look at Passover and leaving of Egypt. And how have we done for time? Not too bad. 9:30 is where we aim to finish. So 9:36. Before I stop recording, does anyone want to ask anything or state anything? Has it been interesting? Hopefully. Yeah.
Just going way back to the other Egyptians who believed alongside the Israelites, because it says, you get to chapter 12, that many other people went up with them, as well as large droves of livestock.
Yeah.
It seems
that of them do.
They attach themselves to the Hebrews.
There's a really interesting little bit which I probably won't have time to touch on, but I picked up from someone who's done a story of the Exodus, which takes a very, very liberal view. He's a liberal Jew who's written this one, but what was interesting is there's been a whole lot of genetic research done on Jews, and what's really interesting is most of the tribes do actually go back to kind of a mixed group. The only exception is the priestly line, and what's interesting is, because it's the priestly line that not only do they marry within Israel, but they're supposed to stay within Levi as well, and they actually go back to about this period to a handful of people. So if you look at the genetic marker for parents, about this period where the Exodus is happening, 1450. So there's a handful. They all go back to just a handful of fathers, which is interesting. The kind of, you think about the pharaonic family, but the other tribes are much more mixed, and actually that sometimes is a shock to people because they think that all the Israeli tribes were nice and pure nationalities. But in actual fact, as I was saying, God has constantly been drawing in new families right the way through history, and actually we actually have the testimony of it there in Scripture.
Isn't
so-
Caleb?
Caleb is
Caleb's,
not.
Yeah.
He represents Judah, but he's
not
a
actually.
proselyte.
Okay, yeah.
Where's he originally from?
I think he's
Was he Midian or
Midianite, yeah.
I think so.
Anyway,
Yeah.
He's not.
No. Well, I think it's an interesting thing that if you trace it, because often in people, what you find is in people's minds they think of the Jewish people as a kind of a genetically pure thing, but actually, if you look at both the history of it and the genetics of it, they've constantly been drawing folks into them. Obviously, Ruth is another person who is kind of drawn in.
But it's fascinating that the Levitical line is kept pure.
Yes, it's a thread within that. It's the Cohen line. So
Really?
yeah. So it's the priest. This is the priestly line.
Well,
So
we
it's-
get Testaments.
Yeah. So the priestly line weren't allowed to even marry outside of the tribe. The others would marry kind of within the wider mix of the nations anyway, of the nation. Anyway, I'll stop recording now. But so next week we'll be doing the Passover, and